Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. Today, this video will be about the murder of President JFK, which is probably the most famous murder case in history. And I have two very special guests. One of them is Mark Zaid, attorney from Washington, D.C., and the other one is investigative journalist Gerald Posner. And as I was mentioning, my guests today are very special, and I would say that they are the best of the best at their jobs, but we'll get to it in a second. Mark is a very famous attorney and works mainly on government transparency cases. He represents spies and whistleblowers, and he has covered cases such as D.B. Cooper, the death of Princess Diana, the death of President Lincoln, the Lockerbie terrorist attack, and he also represented people connected to this case we are discussing today because he represented Secret Service agencies. One of them was also accused of having murdered the president, and also some of the conspiracy authors that needed support, even if probably the conclusion we'll reach today are not the same ones as the conspiracy authors. Gerald is a very famous investigative journalist, and he has written several books and also covered cases such as the murder of Martin Luther King, 9/11, and the connection with the Saudi royal family. And he's also probably your most famous book, Gerald, is the one about the Vatican and the connection between money and power, and how the church does crazy things with the money and power. And also, you wrote a book about the crime in Miami. And of course, your book that we will talk about today is the one about JFK called Case Closed. Is that right? And it's also a Pulitzer finalist in history. Thank you guys for your time. Thanks to the both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, absolutely.
So, before we start with the questions that I have for you guys tonight, would you like to tell me and my viewers what sparked your interest in the case? Because this is very interesting. This is a case that changed history, but not a lot of people have put so much effort as you guys did in this investigation.
Sure. I'll start further because even though Gerald is a ton older than me, which seems to shrink every day that goes by, because I remember when I first met him, he seemed a lot older, and now he doesn't seem very much older because he's not that much older than me. But it's enough to make a difference in our interests as far as where we were in our life. But I predated his interest in this case back into the mid 1970s when I was a kid. Now, when we talk about the assassination in the research community, it's kind of broken down into three groups, at least for me. One is the original group of people who, from day one, these guys were on this case throughout the 1960s. And then you had really a second group that was somewhat in between that and Oliver Stone's 1991 JFK film that for whatever reason they became interested. I put myself into that category. In the mid 1970s, I was a voracious reader as a young kid, going to the library, taking out 20 books at a time. And I vividly remember reading about the Kennedy assassination, and especially this one book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, which came out in 1967, and reading the Warren Commission report and books about it. And that really sparked my interest. But because I was a kid, I had no idea what was going on in Washington, D.C. with respect to the congressional investigations into the case. In fact, my first trip to D.C. in 1979 as a sixth grader, which that meant for elementary schools, we're 11 and 12, I came here and I was telling my schoolmates, my classmates, about the connections of the Lincoln assassination and the Kennedy assassination. The killer was in a theater and ran to a warehouse and went a whatever farm to where everything was opposite of one another. They had a vice president named Johnson. They were born in the same years and all sorts of wacky just coincidences, even though right across the street was an ongoing congressional investigation. And then the third generation came in because of the Stone film that reawakened a lot of people, probably wrongly, because of the information that led them to think there was a conspiracy, which we'll obviously talk about it. But I never was able to put pen to paper like Gerald did and put his real mark on it. So I will say Gerald's had far greater influence on the masses than I have, but I can talk in the weeds about things that I have done on this case to hopefully make a difference one way or the other.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we all come to the case in a different way. I'm the end of a generation that actually has a memory of the day that Kennedy was killed. So I was in fourth grade, 9 years old. But the reason I remember it so well is because I was at a Catholic school. My mother's side of the family my grandparents were immigrants from Italy. He was the first Catholic president, so he was a big deal. My grandmother had a picture of Kennedy in our three-room apartment, in addition to the crucifix and that. I remember the trauma of that day. For me personally, the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 1968 had more personal impact. I was a 14-year-old kid, but I was always interested in the case. And when I was in law school in the late 70s, the House Select Committee was re-examining the case and came to a conclusion it was a conspiracy based on this flawed, we can talk about it later, acoustic evidence. But that convinced me that something was wrong. And I went to a publisher after having done a couple of books on the Chinese mafia and had the heroin trade and a book on a Nazi war criminal, and said to them, how about a book on the Kennedy assassination that just examines all of the people that are supposedly behind it, the mafia, the KGB, the Cubans. Let me look at all of it as an attorney, as Mark would do if he was going in, and tell you which theories are right and which ones aren't, narrow it down to 4 or 5 that we can't resolve. I didn't think I was going to come to a conclusion that said, here's what happened in the case. Only when doing the research in the early 90s, then did I come to that feeling that it was Oswald alone and that there were answers to the conspiracies and the questions that have been raised. Will you ever get 100% certainty? No. I think part of the problem with my book, and Mark will attest to this, is that the publisher called it case closed. Yes, it would be nice to think that it was possible to close the case on the Kennedy assassination, but they did it, and and that's what I think happened at that point in history. But that's how we got to where we are today in terms of our interest on the case.
So, as you mentioned, Gerald, um, Kennedy was very loved back then. And today we also have the impression that Kennedy was loved by everybody because, for instance, there are also fiction writers. For instance, there's a very interesting novel by Stephen King, according to which the main character is able to travel in time and he wants to travel back in time to avoid President Kennedy from being assassinated, thinking that probably he would save like the history of the world from that point on. And there's also another novel by Mario Puzo that is called The Fourth Kennedy, and he envisions this fourth Kennedy guy as being someone who can, turn the whole world to a better situation. So, what was, according to you guys, the situation in '63? Was he that popular back then as well, or did he have a good share of enemies as well?
Every American president has a share of enemies, right? There are certainly people that don't like. If any modern American president is killed, we'll have a short list of immediate groups that we think might be suspects behind it. And with Kennedy, although he was greatly admired and was very popular, he also had ingrained enemies. And some of the speculation is he had ingrained enemies inside the U.S. government, people that were furious at him inside the CIA, people that were furious in the Cuban community, the anti-Castro Cubans who felt he had let them down. He was like a traitor for not having gone ahead at the Bay of Pigs. There were right-wingers who thought that he was selling out the country to communism. So the tough part always is he has his share of enemies. Then the hard part is figuring out whether any of those enemies were behind the shooter that day who killed him in Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, it was a different time in the early 1960s for the United States, a lot of which contributed to Kennedy's image. This notion of Camelot, he's always been associated with, King Arthur and, our parentage from the United Kingdom. This was the closest we've ever had to sort of a king and a queen. Now, he was the youngest president in 60 years since Teddy Roosevelt, who became president when McKinley was assassinated. But he also had a beautiful wife. But the difference between Teddy Roosevelt and JFK was television. Television had come about, and color television. And anyone who knows about history and the debates between Richard Nixon as then the sitting vice president and JFK, it was a vast difference. If you watched the debate on television, you thought Kennedy won. If you listened to the debate on the radio, you thought Nixon had won. So that contributed to this environment. And he was a World War II hero with PT 109. And of course, his family was very prominent. His father had been, the ambassador to England, etc. And there's all sorts of historical fiction novels about if his father had become president, what that would have looked like instead, or Lindbergh and things like that, rather than JFK. But there were a lot of problems too. Gerald mentioned about him being a Catholic. That unlike today, that was a huge, huge issue. And I think probably many of us can't really fathom it, that would be such a big deal at the time. But hey, in the United States, as we're recording this, we're about to have our elections, and only the second woman ever running for president of the United States, even though vast majority of other modern countries have had women leaders decades earlier. So it was a very different time.
Mark, one thing you said that about the Catholics at the high hurdle of that. One of the anti-Semitic tropes used is against Jewish voters is that they have dual loyalty, right? Israel and then Americans. And that's what was used against Catholics. The idea was that a Catholic candidate would be loyal to the Pope and the church before the United States. I think that's so amazing. It seems so 1800s, much less, 1960, but it was in fact still being bounced around.
Well, let's get to the main character of all this story. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? And what drove him to do what he did? Because we know that he was fascinated with Russia, and he also had the Russian wife. So, can you guys tell us something about the background, who this guy was?
Thanks, Mark, for nothing on that. But Oswald. For all your listeners, Leonardo, the thing that might surprise them is that he just turned 24 years old the month before he killed Kennedy. They think of him somehow as older, in his 30s or that. He's really still very, very young. And he's had an unusual life in the sense that not many people in the heart of the Cold War defected as an ex-Marine to the Soviet Union and declared their loyalty. Then not many people worked their way back with a Russian wife and then went ahead to New Orleans and gave out pamphlets to try to join a pro-Castro organization. Not many people were going down to Mexico City to try to go off and join the revolution in Cuba, or taking a pot shot. Many of your listeners might be surprised, just a few months before he killed Kennedy, at a retired Army general in Dallas, thinking he might be the next Hitler and maybe he could solve that. So Oswald, even when he was 13 years old and interviewed by a psychiatrist in New York City because he had been a truant, he'd not gone to school, and found him psychologically maladjusted, doesn't tell you he's going to be an assassin, doesn't tell you he's the person who killed Kennedy, and doesn't really give you the answer as to why. One of the most frustrating things in this case is why. We could talk about how we each see that differently, but he certainly was a troubled and unusual person who, when he finally is accused of killing the president, if you know him, it's not a shock that he could be in that window shooting at the president that day.
Yeah, I always recommend people to, and nowadays you can just Google. I bought the old 33 records back in the day where you could listen, or had a cassette tape, listen to Oswald's radio debates, his interviews earlier that year. And unlike what the Warren Commission did portray him as, he wasn't an idiot. He wasn't educated by way of school or anything, but he's very interesting to listen to of this conversation. And he had a very difficult upbringing. He had a very overbearing mother. His father died and was never, like, barely ever, if ever, in the picture for him. He had an older brother, Robert, who was several years older, as I recall, but wasn't particularly close, lost touch with him. He was kind of a free spirit. He without a doubt, he had an ego towards himself and thought that he should amount to something more than he ever did. And you can see that during his time in the Soviet Union, which, as Gerald said he defected to in 1959 before he became disillusioned and came back to the United States in 1962. He's a very interesting character. But the lack of a motive has always been the issue for many people. In fact, the only evidence that is in the Warren Commission report is that Marina Oswald, his then became widow, had testified that he had only spoken highly of President Kennedy. But, sometimes motives are difficult to ascertain. Look, we've recently had 2 assassination attempts on former President Trump. The first one, I represent one of the Secret Service agents who was on duty that day in Butler, Pennsylvania. I also now represent the former director of the Secret Service who resigned in the aftermath. And trying to ascertain that shooter who was killed at the scene by the Secret Service, his motives, the guy was all over the place. And he was 20 years old, and he apparently disliked Republicans and disliked Democrats. And for whatever reason, he chose Trump to be the one to go after. And this is in an age where there's social media, and you can look at what he has online, and you can look at his text messages, you can look at his emails, you can look at his internet search history, right? None of that existed for Oswald. So for trying to investigate a case that happened in the 1960s, you're basically relying on either eyewitness testimony or, hey, here's a mail order form for a rifle and a scope. And does the handwriting match?
And, Mark, you may not agree with this, but the Oswald that I came to understand is somebody who, at this moment in November of 63, is sort of given an opportunity with Kennedy's motorcade coming in front. He only learns a couple of days beforehand that it's happening because it's published in the newspapers. The 2 Dallas newspapers, they publish the route, they show the map. He's gotten a job there a month earlier through a friend of his wife. And it's an opportunity for him to possibly enter the history books and throw a cog in the machinery of government. The Oswald that I know could have been on a 6th floor in a building in downtown Moscow shooting at Nikita Khrushchev if he had been in Moscow and that opportunity had come up. But there's a point with Oswald that seems peculiar to people that don't know it, and that is that when he's tried to kill this army general before he's failed, the bullet grazes the window, he learns about Kennedy's motorcade, and he has to go out to get his rifle, which is not in Dallas where he's staying in a rooming house. It's where his wife is staying with this a friend out in Irving, Texas. When he goes there that night before to get the rifle, which he brings in the next day in a brown paper bag and tells the fellow driving him in it's curtain rods, he has a discussion with his wife, Marina, and they were separated at the time, and he says, come back with me. Come back with me. I'll buy you a washing machine. They didn't have a lot of money. They had a couple $100s. And he makes this concerted effort. And she says later, I'm putting words in her mouth. I was such a jerk. I was so mad at him. And I refused to budge, and I wouldn't do it. And that night when they went to sleep, at one point she says her leg came over and rested on his, and he pushed it away with this sort of ferocity. And she thought, he's in a mean mood. She woke up the next morning. He had left their wedding ring on the counter and all the money they had, like $195 on the counter. What I don't know, and I don't know how you feel about this, Mark, was he just saying to Marina, get back together, and then if she said yes, he was still going to kill Kennedy the next day? Or was he real? And I'm not putting the blame on her. I don't mean to say, Marina's responsible for having rejected him. But people go crazy if you say that the assassination of the president could have been something that was, as equivocal as, will my wife come back with me? Will I get my wife back on, or will I get my life back on the road, or will I go ahead and kill JFK tomorrow? They want to hear, like with Sirhan, I hate him, I hate him, I hate him. I'm going to kill this person. And that's not always here. It's certainly not here in this case.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of comparisons. I have sat through a number of congressional investigation depositions on the Trump assassination attempt. All the reports that are being issued now. I mean, I was behind the scenes on this, and I would sit through these investigations and these depositions of agents just going, oh my God, this is like what it was with the Warren Commission all these years. I'm dealing with these generally young congressional staffers who are lawyers. So they're in their mid to late 20s, maybe early 30s, like many of the Warren Commission lawyers were, and the actual investigators. And they're asking questions that could have easily have been asked about the Kennedy assassination. At one point, they asked, uh, were any of the agents out drinking the night before, which was one of the allegations against the Secret Service agents in Kennedy, in Dallas, at the time. And I will tell you, having looked into the Butler, Pennsylvania attempt, it was a lot of issues, just like what you've described, that if one little fact had been different, it might not have ever have happened. I mean, we'll never know for any of these things. These are the stuff of Stephen King or Dom DeLeo's Libra, where you just add in some facts to create a different pathway for a different story, so we'll never know. But it could have easily been just a little nudge one way or the next. If Marina had gone back with him, maybe he wouldn't have.
And the thing is, if Oswald had lived, let's say Oswald has spent the next 50 years in prison, there would be opportunities. People would have interviewed him. He would have spoken. It's like James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray ran away and said, "Oh, it's not me. It was this guy Raoul." But after decades and decades, people finally lost faith in that story, and they were able to see it. If Ray had been killed 2 days after he was arrested by somebody with ties to like white supremacist organization, we'd be off and running on conspiracy theories. And I think one of the many problems with Oswald is you have this unusual lack of a clear motivation. People love to know what the motive is, and then you have him gone. So we then never know, as you say, and everything has to be pieced together from others. And it's unsatisfying, without a doubt.
Yeah, Siran still gives the interviews, I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and he has said so many contradictory things all over the years that I think that he contributed himself to spreading conspiracy theories. But at least we have some good explanations, and we can hear his voice. So I'm definitely with you guys on this.
Well,
But how,
and this, as an aside, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit. Jack Ruby,
Yeah.
the guy was in prison from November 63 till January 1967 with interviews, and he would not shut up.
No one knows that.
We'll talk about that in a little bit more.
He would not shut up. You're right. He talked to anybody that would talk to him. But of course, and Mark knows this very well, to somebody who thinks it's a conspiracy, they will say, but he was just about to tell a real story right before he died. They injected him with cancer.
Jack Ruby likes to hear his own voice. That's for sure. But how do you guys explain that this case has sparked so many different conspiracy theories? Because all the other cases I've investigated pretty much have one. For instance, 9/11, they say it was staged by the government. Moon landings, they say they were faked and done in a Hollywood studio or something like that. But with JFK, it seems like conspiracy theorists want to find an alternative solution, and it really doesn't matter what explanation they give. They just have to find another one. So they pretty much contradict themselves. How come?
Yeah, I am fascinated by conspiracies, which is why I've worked on so many of these cases. Some people look at it and they actually make a conspiracy out of all the different conspiracy cases that I worked on. Like, how could it be he's involved with the Lincoln assassination, the Kennedy assassination, Princess Diana, Lockerbie, D.B. Cooper, the Trump assassination? There's got to be a connection. Maybe somehow Zaid is involved with pulling this all off. No, I'm fascinated by it. It's just really, from a historical standpoint, it's pretty amazing. And it's not just solving what the case is, it's watching and reviewing how people think. And in fact, that's what changed my mind on the Kennedy case. It was a thought process. It was going to law school and then working in and around, not in the US government, I've never been, but representing people in the US government, seeing it firsthand, and having this kind of legalistic thought process where law school really does change how you think, and analyzing it and understanding what evidence is and what it's not, and that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of something else. And the internet has changed all of this now, where you see conspiracy theories grow even more, how susceptible humans are. And it doesn't matter if they're in Italy or the United States or Australia or they speak some rare dialect in the jungles of Africa or something like that. It still exists in the human mindset. And people just don't want to accept sort of a ground truth. I think the O.J. Simpson case really does explain why the JFK case remains unsolved. Anytime you put something under a microscope, you're going to find flaws. I mean, the vast majority of people, I think, reasonable people, do not believe O.J. Simpson was innocent of murdering his ex-wife and Ron Goldman. He got acquitted. That's a different thing. Brilliant lawyers against lawyers who weren't as good and messed up their prosecution led to the result. But if you took, you took this coffee mug, which works perfectly fine, and you examined it microscopically, I'm sure there are flaws throughout the porcelain or whatever the heck this is made out of. And the problem is in the Kennedy case, everybody dives down so deep on every little thing that if you find a crack, you think, oh, that means it's, there it is. It can't be the way we said it was or they said it was. And then there's a nature of, not want to believe the government, and the Vietnam War contributed to it, and other conspiracies contributed to it, because there are conspiracy theories that do exist. The government's cover up of the case with respect to certain aspects of trying to assassinate foreign leaders, trying to protect sources and methods, and other things that we can get into more detail. All of that contributed to why there is still this notion of a conspiracy that is the reason why I don't do this anymore. I don't get involved with it because I do not believe that, contrary to Gerald's book publishing editor's idea to say case closed, the case will never be. Now, I believe I'm with Gerald. As far as I'm concerned, it's closed for me. It's closed for him. Other than that, we keep doing, things like this, and we keep trying to get more documents out, and because it's all about transparency. But there will be people who will never, ever, ever let this go. And there will be people who think there's a flat earth society. You know what? At some point in time, you just got to move on, and you say, guys, you believe what you want, but I'm going to get back on with my life and go out to Sunday dinner with my family.
No, I think you're right. And Mark, that you say, why so many conspiracy theories and why, it persisted for so long. And I think not only Ruby's murder of Oswald 2 days later starts it off, but the assassination itself, if you look at it, it's the first modern assassination of a leader of a country with a rifle for the long distance, and the assassin gets away in the immediate aftermath of the shot. That conjures up all of the feelings of Day of the Jackal, a hired assassin, beyond the capability of a 24-year-old kid who was a little bit odd in his life. So you immediately think professional assassin. And then turns out that the accused assassin had been in Russia. So was it the KGB? Khrushchev had been humiliated by Kennedy over the standoff on the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the 1970s, when we find out that the Kennedy brothers were trying to kill Fidel Castro and it failed, was it Fidel who found out they were trying to kill him and instead hit back first? Was it the CIA? Were it the anti-Castro Cubans? So the it changes over time, but the first people who were writing about it in the 60s, as Mark said, were almost always leftists who looked at Oswald being blamed and said, it can't be true that this guy, he's being set up because he's being called a leftist. They just want to set him up. So, Harold Weisberg, others who came to the thing, Buchanan and others, viewed it as it can't be the real solution. And that's sort of where we're back today. I mean, if you ask 9 out of 10 people on the street, you think it's a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination, they'll say yes. Who do you think's behind it? I think most people think it's probably a government, the CIA, this amorphous secret state or whatever else. And so that's become the flavor of the moment, in part because the answer given by, and Mark knows this so well, he has the original set, the Warren Commission, a year later, we don't have faith in blue ribbon panels anymore in this country, if we ever had them. We don't believe that a group of men can go off, and they were all men in this case, and come to a conclusion about what happened in the case without having hearings that we were more involved with, and then lock up files for years after that, issue a report, and that would be the end of it. And like Mark said, Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, so much loss of faith in government. No wonder people don't believe the official explanation.
Well,
And the
let's
Warren
get
Commission made a lot of errors.
It's
sorry,
really
guys, go
important.
ahead.
One thing that Gerald said is really important, because this is where historians fail and people fail in looking at history. And it's understanding that what is necessarily written in front of you, you have to understand the context of it. So the vast majority of so many of the original JFK assassination conspiracists were, as Gerald said, way to the left. Now that influenced what their thinking was and where they were going. And it also was compounded, not through any fault of their own, that they had a limited amount of information by which they could review the case and come up with conclusions. You had the Warren Commission report, all 900 plus pages of it, and you had the 26 volumes that went of hearings and testimony and depositions and documentation, of which there was no index for it. I mean, it took years for, thank God, this one woman to index the books. And even that book, which I own copies of, because now, I mean, I bought mine 30 plus years ago. You could not find this book. This book costs $200-300 in like the 70s and 80s to be able to use as an index. So could you imagine you're trying to research the case into the late 60s and you have to thumb through, right? I mean, I'm holding my arms. Let's see, the whole thing would be about 3 feet long of information. And the stuff, it's not organized in any way, shape, or form. You have an interview from, this day in this part, and then there's one from before it, after that, or then here, and then there's exhibits that relate to one another in different volumes. It's an absolute mess. So one of the things that persuaded me that I don't believe the conspiracy theories any longer was in the 80s, I started to go back in time to review the older conspiracy theories and research those with modern knowledge of how things operated, and to look at the documents, the firsthand documents in the National Archives. And so often, people like Penn Jones, Harold Weisberg, who were instrumental in spreading conspiracy theories. I mean, I knew Harold personally. He lived very close to me. I used to go visit him and everything. He was like a grandfather, figure. But they were wrong on a lot of things because they made informed judgments based on misinformation or a lack of information at the time. And they were just wrong on certain things. But that shaped so many people's views going forward. And it just got repeated in book after book after book. And nobody would ever go back in time to look at a lot of these theories. I mean, Gerald's book does a lot of that. Vince Bugliosi's book is the other one I would recommend, Reclaiming History. That's probably the most documented book of everything. That I knew Vincent. He was the prosecutor of Charles Manson. That guy had an encyclopedic mind. I mean, what a sharp legal mind he had. And if you want an answer to any question on the Kennedy assassination, go look in Gerald's book for sure, but go look in Vince Bugliosi's book, because that book is about a foot thick, and then it's got 900 pages of footnotes on a CD-ROM that that comes with the book.
Yeah, no, it's a great resource. And Leonardo, part of the problem here is Mark's talking about what's available. One of the things not available from the Warren Commission or from the government was the autopsy report in any detail. No pictures, no x-rays initially. The Kennedy family, there was great deference to the Kennedy family that did not want didn't want a lurid public display. Eventually, it's why the president's brain goes missing. We can talk about that. I think it's interred the second time with Jack Kennedy at Arlington. The Kennedys were worried about what had happened with Lincoln or other things, the idea that it could become part of this display. And we felt so bad for the family that I think, I say we, the government, the Warren Commission, Earl Warren, others, gave some deference to that, to the the detriment of public disclosure. And people suspected that the autopsy wasn't that great. Cyril Wecht, a forensic pathologist, thought it was bad. Turns out when we found out more about the autopsy, it wasn't a great autopsy. They did make mistakes, and they did have a drawing what didn't match. So what happens from the perspective of analyzing evidence? I always say, and a lawyer in me, my legal training, or what Mark has, is you're accustomed to, on a case or whatever else, having conflicting evidence, conflicting accounts, evidence that may not match. So your responsibility as an investigator is to find out which is the best evidence, tell readers, or in this case, in my case, readers, what evidence you're relying on and why. So the autopsy is a perfect case in which conspiracy theorists will often cite a drawing made of the autopsy that shows the bullet wound into the back of Kennedy too low to have gone on and really done the single bullet. They'll say that's evidence that that single bullet therefore was impossible. I always say, no, there's better evidence than that drawing, the recollection of where the wound was by the person who made the drawing. There are photographs of the autopsy, which will show you where the wound actually was. And if you can't convince me with some good evidence that those autopsy photographs are faked, then I'm going to rely on those autopsy photographs for the best location of where the wound is, as opposed to the drawing. It means the drawing was incorrect for whatever reason from recollection. People don't like that. They want to pick and choose the evidence they want. And I think what you really need to do is, a lot of people do get lost in the weeds. It's hard to keep a larger picture on this. And we could talk about this more, but I believe that the so-called single bullet, what Oliver Stone calls the magic bullet, is now scientifically verifiable. You can establish from ballistics that it happened as the Warren Commission thought it had. But that doesn't tell you whether you had one assassin at Dealey Plaza or five. Could have just meant that one shooter shooting from behind the president on that day fired one shot that hit the president and went on to wound the governor. That's the so-called single bullet. Doesn't tell you if that person then fired the kill shot. Doesn't tell you if there was another assassin on the grassy knoll. And even if you eventually conclude through the evidence, as I do, that there was only one shooter firing from behind the president in the general location of where Oswald had last been left by his co-workers, and you identify that person as Oswald, it doesn't tell you if there was a conspiracy or not, because he could have been doing it for someone else. So people think if you answer the single bullet and you think it happened, that's the end of the case. For me, it's just the beginning of examining it.
And the single bullet theory was, I have always said, was more of a legal theory than a medical theory. It was Arlen Specter as a junior lawyer having a set of facts, and he came up with a theory. Of course, it had to be medically supported, scientifically, ballistically supported, but it was very much a lawyer mindset of trying to figure out how to take what the result, we know what the end result was. So what would make sense? I'm a big Occam's razor type guy. I use it in my work all the time. The simplest explanation is the best. Doesn't mean there's not a better one, or maybe even a more factual one, but you need to be able to prove it. And since we're talking about the JFK film, which I have it right behind me as people can see,
Oh, yeah.
The notion of in James Garrison, played by Kevin Costner, his infamous courtroom scene, which I have to say I fell victim to, and I used to do it in my initial lectures 35 years ago, putting two chairs in front of one another and taking like a yardstick or some sort of, stick and showing there, from the angle of where the sixth floor was, there's no way it could line up, because I wasn't smart enough at that time yet to pay attention to the actual evidence and realize, hang on, if you look at the car and you see where Governor Connolly was sitting, which was lower and off to the left of the President of the United States, right? Or off to the right, whichever way it is. Off to the left?
A little bit to the right.
Thanks. Sorry. Off to the right. That when you see how the physical car actually was, it totally matches up angle-wise. Now, then you can debate about the bullet and things like that. But that was a false equivalency that Garrison portrayed, and that many, many researchers have portrayed because they didn't pay attention to what the actual evidence was.
Right. And Mark, what was critical is, we sometimes get lucky when we're doing a project or whatever else, or as writers, that somebody else has done research that or had some information that becomes very useful. So there was a group called Failure Analysis, which does courtroom work, and they had presented the American Bar Association the case for and against the single bullet. One of the things they found, Arnold Spector didn't have the ability in 1963 and 64 they could look at each frame of the Zapruder film, the so-called home movie of the assassination, and that's your time clock for the assassination, 18 frames per second. But they couldn't digitize it. They couldn't blow them up. They couldn't see it. And what Failure Analysis saw was that at frame 224, as the motorcade, the car carrying the president and the governor coming out from behind a sign that's blocking the view of the camera, you see the governor's suit, white shirt, and a tie. Frame 224, the right side of his white shirt disappears because the flap of his jacket comes up and covers the shirt for a moment. Then you go and examine the suit. Is that wind? No, it turns out to be a bullet wound through that flap of the jacket that's pushed the jacket up for half a second. You know when the governor's hit. So if we know when the governor's hit, that's the frame that you then have to look at, that frame and the next frame in 18th of a second, as Mark said, to see if the president and the governor line up for that bullet to do a straight line, slowing up as it goes through so that when it finally ends up in the governor's thigh, it's slightly flattened but not deformed and broken up. And the key to this is it could have come back in terms of testing it that was not possible, in which case we'd have a conspiracy at Dealey Plaza. We'd know from that point, if the single bullet doesn't happen, then the shooter, if it's Oswald or whoever, doesn't have time for 4 shots, doesn't get that 4th shot off. And there's something else going on in this case. So for me, looking at that, resolving the single bullet in my own mind was a big step to knowing that it could be one shooter, could be just Oswald alone, but didn't tell you anything else about the case other than just that single shot.
And the notion of Occam's razor being a necessity to figure out how to examine this case, because if you aren't willing to accept the single bullet theory, then by ergo, there has to be a conspiracy. So, okay, where's the other shooter? Where's the evidence of the other shooter? Where's the evidence of that cover-up? It's like pulling a thread from your sweater, right? And you got to be careful that you don't pull too many things out. There are so many parts of this case that we can talk about of if you don't want to believe that fact, what do you replace it with? And if you can't replace it with something, then Occam's razor tells you you still have to stay with that fact because nothing else then makes sense. You have too many, unanswerable questions. And there are some unanswerable questions right now with the Kennedy assassination. Who were the 2 men behind the grassy knoll fence in suits, confronted by a Dallas police officer who the police officer says identified themselves as Secret Service? Because there were no Secret Service agents outside of the motorcade. I represented 2 of them in the motorcade and a third who was part of the protective detail. They were all accounted for. Now, who were those people? The theory is they were Treasury Department, which is who the Secret Service was part of, who were there just watching the motorcade. And it wouldn't have been uncommon to say, I might have been Secret Service, or to flash a Treasury Department badge that the police officer thought was Secret Service. Now, the problem is no one has ever come forward in 61 years to say, yeah, that was me, or that was my dad. They told me that was them, and they were not supposed to be there. They were supposed to be at work, and they, whatever. There could be lots of explanations, but we don't have an answer to that question. So I'm willing to say maybe there's something there more, but okay, but then what does that mean? Is there evidence that they fired a shot? Does the ballistics match up to that? How did they get away then? And I mean, you just keep pulling the thread and more, you're all of a sudden you don't have a sweater any longer. It doesn't work that way.
You're right. But I do think, Mark, that for a lot of people who don't study the case, who just have looked at Oliver Stone's film, seen the Zapruder film on the internet or whatever, the answer as to why they also think it's a conspiracy, everything else aside, Jack Ruby aside, single bullet aside,
Oh, yeah.
is when you see the headshot in full real time, the first time you see it, it's like every movie. You think, oh, that's clear as a bell. He was shot from the front because his head goes back violently to the rear. So we've all seen enough, westerns and like action film. You shoot somebody, they go in the opposite direction. So first time I saw the Zapruder film, I was convinced it looked like a shot from the front. Only when you get into the autopsy and you look at the bullet wound and you talk to people and you understand this small entrance hole in the high right rear portion of Kennedy's head that blows out about a third of his brain and blood matter in this misty cloud of blood material that the two motorcycle cops riding on the back of the car drive right into. And the force of that explosion forces him back into the left. You understand it's a rear shot, but I think a lot of people don't get into those weeds and they look at these Zapruder film and say, oh, those guys, Zaid and Posner, don't know what they're talking about because it was clearly a front shooter.
It's not how it works. It's
Yeah,
not
I
how it
mean,
works.
people, right when I was watching, if you guys are watching The Penguin right now, I don't know if it's showing in Italy, but I mean, it's
It
on
is. I haven't
HBO
started yet,
Max,
but it is. Yeah.
right? And I saw there was one scene, I think it was The Penguin, it might have been Fargo. I'm sorry, it was Fargo. I'm watching Fargo, the television series. It's from years ago, and they shot some guy with a shotgun, and he went flying across the room. That's not how it happens.
Well, guys, you already described the dynamics of it, of the magical bullet theory and the back and to the left thing. So, uh, did Oswald have connection with the FBI? Because we know that he was in touch with an FBI agent by the name of James Host, if I remember well, before the murder of President Kennedy. What happened there with Oswald and the FBI?
You want to start, Gerald?
Okay. I was just, the FBI opened a case file on Oswald when he came back to America after having defected to the Soviet Union. It was a disaster for him. He slit his wrist and tried to kill himself when they told him he couldn't stay. They viewed him as unstable. They moved him to this little provincial capital out at Minsk. And he meets a young Russian girl and ends up marrying her, Marina. And they start the process. He's so dissatisfied in the Soviet Union because he doesn't think they have bastardized the communism that he thought on paper might exist. It's one of the reasons he had disdain for the Russians afterwards. And so he starts the process of wanting to come back. And people say, oh my God, how is it possible? It must have been the CIA or the secret government that allowed him to come back. Because as a defector to the Soviet Union, you would never be allowed back. But there's a process, as Mark knows, for that to take place. And there are a number of other cases in which people had actually renounced their American citizenships. Oswald hadn't done that. So it's a slow process. He comes back, but he's on the FBI radar. They want to talk to him. And when the agents go out from Dallas to try to talk to him, they find him a little belligerent. And they talk to other Russians in the Russian emigre community. So he's on their radar. And Mark will fill this in, but I'm going to jump to the end here. What does the FBI do after the assassination? They're so worried that somebody's going to point a finger at them and say, you should have known this guy was a danger and he was working in the building that where the president's motorcade. They destroyed a note that he had left at the Dallas headquarters, and that later became known and added to the feeling that something untoward had taken place. What do you say, Mark?
It's always about self-interest and CYA, right? Cover your own ass, protect yourself, and Hosty or Hosty, I'm not sure. I never knew exactly how to pronounce his name. I never met him. He destroyed this note. It wasn't high on their radar. I mean, he was on their radar. It wasn't high on their priority list, I guess I would say. I am surprised that he hadn't been interviewed sooner. I mean, there was an office within the CIA that would do that, and for some reason, there's no record that's ever shown up, and I think it's because it just never happened that he wasn't interviewed to find out why. It's not just why did you return. Uh, Soviet Union was a closed society. Most of our information would come from either emigres over or businessmen who would go over to the Soviet Union and they would be debriefed. I mean, Clay Shaw was one of these guys. I mean, that's why he had a relationship with the CIA because he was he was doing business in Europe and elsewhere in communist arranged countries or around the region. And you could say, hey, how many bridges did you see? Was the bridges in good repair or not? How many factories did you see? Was there a lot of meat, in the butcher shop and things like that? That's how we got the information, right? You didn't have spy satellites yet. To be able to see how many forces or planes were on the ground. I mean, we had the U-2, but we didn't have that. There wasn't flying all over the place to the same extent. And obviously one got shot down. That was part of the problem. But you didn't, that was a plane. You didn't have the satellites. But I mean, I represented the consular official in our embassy in Moscow who Oswald threw his passport at when he defected, but he didn't renounce his U.S. citizenship. This is where the law comes into play. People are like, "What do you mean? How could we let this guy back in the U.S.?" Because he was still a U.S. citizen. He didn't sign the paperwork to renounce his citizenship. And there was a program where the State Department would loan people money if they needed it. So they loaned him $410. And the original files make it really clear why that happened. And in fact, one of the reasons why they let Oswald back into the country, or at least the family, was the Soviet Union had already made it clear that they were granting Marina and their daughter, a Soviet citizen, two citizens, exit visas. And there's this great State Department internal memo that hadn't been out, it took years to get out, where it's like, we need to let this guy back in because the Soviet Union are going to use it as propaganda against us that we, the United States, don't believe in families and they do. And we're also concerned that they're going to stop allowing Jewish Soviet immigrants to come to the United States because that was a big push, even back then, to try and get Jewish survivors who had gone over into the Soviet Union after World War II to let them out. So there were a lot of reasons why to let him in, uh, but bad coincidence that the FBI had contact with him in the weeks before.
And Mark, what is on and what's on in Oswald's own writings? What is he mad at during that entire time? He views the process to get back into the U.S. as torturously slow. He's complaining about how slow it is. It's exactly what you would almost expect. Why isn't it faster? Why can't it be done quicker? Everything else, anxious to get back. Not, and in some ways, I don't know if Mark agrees with this, but his view, I think he in essence says this, but he's coming back to the lesser of two evils, or maybe he doesn't have any love for the United States when he returns here. It's only when he gets turned on a little bit in 1963 to the idea of a revolution that's really taking place, and what Castro's doing in Cuba, that he might have found a spot. But he has no love for the American system and not much love for what the Soviets had done to Marxism and to what Lenin had originally started.
Yeah, I mean, all the work that he was doing down in New Orleans and the Dallas Fair Play for Cuba committee, which didn't exist, he's the only member. It was all about what Castro was doing, and that revolution down there. Of course, he was trying to get to Cuba, which was one reason why he went to Mexico City as well. And I'll say the one thing we talked about, the notion of, well, could there have been anybody else behind him? I think the one plausible possibility, and this is total conjecture because no one has ever come forward to it. But again, just thinking on like, why all of a sudden would he do this? Like, we don't have a motive per se. We have a contrary evidence that he seemed to like Kennedy, but he wanted to go to Cuba. He was involved with these pro-Castro Cubans. He was fighting with the anti-Castro Cubans down in New Orleans with Carlos Bringuier. What we're missing is his interactions with other Cubans or other pro-Castro Cubans who, if you look at his personality, you can at least envision this of the notion of him being a big talker, complaining about the Kennedy government in the United States, not doing enough to help the Castro and everything, and that Castro should do more. And you could just see some pro-Castro Cuban telling Oswald, well, you damn gringo, put your money to where your mouth is. You talk so big, like, oh, you're going to do so much. Why don't you go ahead and do something then? And then, oh my God, he fricking does it.
Right.
But we've never had anybody come forward and say, yeah, he told us he was going to do us. And you can imagine why they haven't done that. Although if that did happen, you would think maybe somebody by now
Yeah.
would have
Yeah,
said
I
something.
agree.
But if you're thinking about a motive, what would have pushed him to do it? You could think about with his personality, he was taunted to do it, but total conjecture.
And
So there
and
was
and
nobody else behind him. He was not sent by the Italian mob or by the government or
but
anybody else.
Leonardo, think of this. Here's what people don't know, and this is, I think, critical for me at least. It's always my challenge to conspiracy theorists. On September 25th and September 26th of 1963, Oswald leaves New Orleans to go to Mexico City. He's going to try to get down to Havana. If he had been successful, if the Cuban mission and the Soviets had allowed him to go, he would have been in Havana when Kennedy was visiting Dallas, but they reject him. The reason that's so important, he's on this 16-hour bus ride with different buses to stop in Laredo and then go to Nuevo and then end up in Mexico City. That's the day, September 26th, that the White House announces for the first time that Jack Kennedy is going to visit Texas on a political tour and that Dallas will be one of the cities. So everything that happened in Oswald's life before September the 26th, 1963, or for conspiracies, somebody planning to kill Kennedy with Oswald as a factor, would have happened without the idea that Kennedy would be in Dallas, Oswald would be rejected and coming back to Dallas. So if there's a conspiracy involving Oswald with the Italian mafia, with the KGB, with Castro, whoever, it has to take place when Oswald returns either in Mexico City or returns to Dallas. And you can't do it by telepathy. You can't do it by text message or whatever else. Somebody has to reach out to him. There has to be a telephone call. Somebody has to show up. And that's the evidence that's also missing. We have a very narrow window. We're not looking for a conspiracy that was formed a year earlier or 2 years earlier. To put that conspiracy into works, you have to know the place and the time where the president will be, and that Oswald, the person you want to put in as the assassin or one of the shooters, is going to be. And that doesn't happen until late September when Oswald's on his way to Mexico.
Doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. So it's impossible. He acted alone.
Well,
There's,
and you look again, if you want to disregard something from an evidentiary standpoint, what do you replace it with? Oh, Oswald didn't bring a rifle. That the rifle found on the sixth floor was not the right anything that Oswald brought. He brought curtain rods. Okay, well, where are the curtain rods? Where did the curtain rods ever go to? And why are there curtain rods at his home and in his rooming house? He doesn't need curtains, or they're still there. So he didn't take anything with him. The notion of he's the only one of the entire sixth floor, entire depository building who leaves the building after the assassination. When they finally, I don't know if they locked it down, but when they're finally checking around, he's the only employee who's not there. And the allegation is, of course, that he killed Officer J.D. Tippit. The evidence that he killed Tippit is even greater than the evidence that he killed the president of the United States. He's captured with the gun, the handgun that was used. I'm not a fan of eyewitness testimony because it is so unreliable.
sure.
And I wrote about this and I got lambasted because I said that Jean Hill was wrong in what her eyewitness testimony was, because I could track it over. This is back 30 years, 35 years ago almost. You could track it, from the November 22nd, 1963. She was one of the eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza. You could track it from then till the day she died. And her story changed so many times over years because she got influenced by people talking in her left ear and her right ear. She couldn't keep straight what she actually saw that day. But if you want to believe eyewitness testimony like some of the conspiracist theorists do, what about the handful of, like, I don't know, Gerald, what was it, 6, 8 people,
Eight people.
right,
Yeah.
who like saw him up close kill? Two guys followed him after he shot the officer and followed him to where he went, to the shoe store, and then the shoe store guy was like, "Who is this guy acting so weird in my shoe store?" and followed him to the theater, and everybody pointed to the cops. He's there. He's there.
And the Leonardo, there's something I always say that the answer for me as to why I think it's Oswald alone is sort of Oswald. If you get to know him, because what Mark just said is critical. Once you get to know Oswald, as Marcus said, he thinks he's smarter than he is. He is smart, but he's politically very involved. He's always about politics. The Oswald that I came to know, if he had been nothing to do with the assassination and had learned that the president had been shot at or saw it take place in front of where he worked, he'd be out in Dealey Plaza asking people what happened, collecting information. But what does he say afterwards? When he's arrested, they said, "Why did you leave?" He said, "Well, I heard that the president had been shot, so I thought that was the end of work for the day, so I just left." It's so against everything you know about Lee Harvey Oswald. Here he is, sort of immersed in politics, and he hears that this historic assassination attempt is played out in front of where he was working. He figured, I have the day off. I'll just go back to my rooming house, grab my pistol, and go out and kill a cop. It doesn't add up very well.
Well, of course, because he knew the people who put him up to it were about to come and try and kill him. There's just no evidence he had any conversations with anybody about that.
Right. So what I say about that, by the way, and I don't know, if the people, let's assume for a second it's a conspiracy and that Oswald was either a patsy or he was set up. You only have to kill Oswald if he wasn't. If he's a patsy, he's going to be run over by a freight train, going to be framed, sent away for killing Kennedy and not know what hit him. So he's involved somehow. He brings in the rifle. He does something. He plays some role. So you have to kill him as well. Now, the people who have done this secret state or whatever it is, conspiracy, they pulled off essentially the perfect crime in Dallas because they fooled Mark Zaid, they fooled me, they fooled a lot of people. They kept it basically a secret, no smoking gun evidence. The one thing they failed to do was to kill Oswald at the scene. They have a cop who runs into him. Oswald runs into a cop when he's trying to leave the building. If that had been a dirty cop as part of the conspiracy, he would have shot Oswald on the spot and would have been a hero for having killed the assassin. So Oswald the assassins have figured out everything, the conspirators, except they forget to kill Oswald because what does he do? He leaves the building from the front steps. He gives them the shake by going out the front door. And then you have to go and get Jack Ruby, who sort of is given the most important assignment of his life. Jack, we made a mistake. We allowed this guy to live. The entire conspiracy to kill the president could unravel if he speaks. And Jack Ruby says, okay, I'll do it like when I feel like it. And Friday night, he's down at police headquarters and he's near Oswald and doesn't do it. And Saturday, he's down there and doesn't do it. And Sunday, he gets around to it. So when you put it together, it's not that it becomes comical, but you understand the failure of the conspiracy that we are led to believe in Oliver Stone's film and other things exist that's so powerful and so wonderful. But the one thing that was missed was allowing Oswald to sort of live, and it just never adds up.
Well, let's go back a few steps. You guys already said that the autopsy was probably not properly reported, but it was sort of well done. What does it tell us in terms of how the homicide went?
How the other what? I didn't hear that last part.
What does the autopsy tell us in terms of how the homicide evolved, what happened?
So for me, all the autopsy tells me that I can walk away with by examining the x-rays and the photographs is that the only entrance wounds on Kennedy that day, you really can't tell from the head because the headshot is a mess, is an entrance wound in the high neck shoulder. When you don't know when that happened, it was first, second, or third shot. The autopsy doesn't tell you that. You can't see the exit wound because the doctors at Parkland did a tracheotomy right over that wound. They initially thought and reported incorrectly that that was the entrance wound. That's been cited for 60 years, although they all said later they never turned the president over on the stretcher, so they never saw even the smaller wound in the back. So all you could tell from the autopsy is an entrance wound in the high neck shoulder, and the mess of the head is difficult to figure out until you start to see how much brain matter left here. That doesn't tell you, though, Leonardo, if there were other shots. There could have been 2, 3, 4 that missed. Doesn't tell you if there was a front shooter who was ready to shoot and didn't, if that makes sense. Sure. You have to go far beyond the autopsy to determine what happened at Dealey Plaza.
Well, who's this Jack Ruby guy who managed to kill Oswald, and how could he do that and without being stopped?
Yeah, Mark. Ruby is a fascinating bit player type of guy. A friend of mine wrote a book about him recently, Danny Fingeroth, which I recommend for people to read. look, he was a he had ties to organized crime because he's in the strip club industry, and he's well connected to police in Dallas because this is the type of guy, who would kind of beat people up, rough them around. He was very protective of his girls who worked at the club. Single guy. He was born in 1911 in Chicago. Jacob Rubenstein is Jewish. Didn't fight in right? Didn't fight in the war, as I recall. I guess he was too old at the time. It came to Dallas. He's involved with all these battles with these other strip club owners, was really pissed off at the other strip club owners that they didn't close their business in memory of President Kennedy's assassination, actually. And he was also a guy who wanted to be like the big man on campus. The notion of trying to figure things out, and I'll give you an example of like why there's problems. I remember, or why there's problems with how the cover up of information caused problems. Gerald already mentioned the fact about the note that the FBI destroyed, which obviously just makes things look suspicious. Well, Jack Ruby was a low-level informant for the FBI in 1959, and I had drinks with Burt Griffin, who was one of the Warren Commission junior lawyers, and was involved with kind of the lead investigator on the Ruby case. He didn't know that at the time. I mean, I had drinks with him like 30 years ago, so it's 30 years after the assassination. The FBI didn't reveal that. Now, it had nothing to do with anything. It had no connection whatsoever to Oswald. It had no connection to the assassination. But the fact that Ruby had that relationship with the FBI, similar to how Clay Shaw, who Jim Garrison prosecuted, had relations with the CIA, which totally makes sense given what was going on in the world at the time, it compounds the conspiracy theories. And, Jack Ruby, again, if you take a piece of the evidence out, you need to replace it. Right before he kills Oswald, he's sending money to one of his strippers, and there's testimony from the people who were in line with him at the Western Union that he was just standing there quietly, patiently. He wasn't like, hey, can I cut you? Can I cut in front of you? I need to really go. I mean, Oswald was supposed to have already been transferred before that time. And Ruby's just casually, patiently trying to send this $20 wire to one of his strippers, and then just happens to go then to the jail cell, leaves his beloved Sheba, his dog, who anyone who knows Jack Ruby knows how much he loves this dog, leaves her locked in the car as if, hey, I'm coming back, and then goes down the stairway and, oh, look, Oswald's still there. Boom, with the gun in his pocket. All right, so if you want that to be part of the conspiracy, who tipped him off exactly what time Oswald was going to be moved? And they kept it to clockwork precision that exactly, we're not going to move him until Jack shows up at the top of the stairs.
Mark, you just hit the nail on the head on the last part. So I had a conspiracy theorist tell me once when I went through the whole thing about Oswald was supposed to have been moved an hour beforehand. Ruby went down to the Western Union station, the only one open in Dallas that day, stood in line patiently. He said, without missing a beat, that's because they, meaning, they, were not going to bring Oswald downstairs until Ruby arrived. So if Ruby hadn't gotten there for another hour, they would have found another excuse to keep Oswald there. And of course, you can't answer that because it's just, it's just what they say. But here's the key for me on Ruby and the mob. It turns out that a former FBI man, Bill Romer, was the one who told me about this, but there's a lot on it now. The FBI had illegally bugged the headquarters of the Chicago Mafia. And Chicago's where Ruby's from originally years ago, so he supposedly connected somehow to the Chicago mob. Sam Giancana, the head of the Chicago mob, they illegally bugged from 1959 and on the actual headquarters that Giancana used. The Giancana and the rest of the Chicago mob didn't even know the FBI knew where their headquarters was. Occasionally, starting in 62, 63, and 64, they would say on these tapes that they could never use in court, but they wanted to collect the information. Do you think, by the way, that maybe the feds know where we are. They would call in a guy to sweep the place. The feds would actually break in, take the bugs out. The place would be swept and found clean, and they'd put them back in. The reason it's so critical is after the Kennedy assassination, they were listening to Giancana and the rest of the hierarchy of the Chicago Mafia as virgins. They didn't know they were being recorded. They were all talking about the president being killed and how shocked they were, but they didn't know who Jack Ruby was on Sunday. When he killed Kennedy, the amazing part is in those, and they didn't disclose that for nearly 15 years that those tapes even existed. It doesn't answer everything, but it's critical that the mob sitting around talking to themselves without knowing that anyone's listening isn't saying, hey, that's our guy. That's Jack. He pulled it off. He did it. Instead, they're saying, who's that guy? He's from Chicago. Really? You know him? I don't know. And it was a fascinating bit of contemporaneous information.
Yeah, and as I said, he lived for 3 years after he reversed his conviction because of unfair pretrial publicity. He was going to have a new trial, but he died of cancer beforehand, which he'd been diagnosed a few weeks earlier. But he would talk all the time. People were, oh, he was what? He was too scared to say anything because they would what? They would kill him, like they did. I mean, come on. If he's already been in there for 3 years and he keeps saying it, he had a sanity hearing, and I didn't remember this until recently when I was going back over my friend's book. He had a sanity hearing to determine was he insane, unfit to stand trial, and he was one of the people who testified against this insanity. Like he wouldn't shut up. He spoke apparently more than like any of the state's witnesses, or he testified as a state witness, apparently. I mean, you couldn't shut him up. Um, and so this notion that somehow there was this grand conspiracy. Now, there were certain things that come out. One theory was, oh, he did it so Jackie wouldn't have to come to Dallas to stand trial, or, to testify when Oswald was. And that, the lawyers came up with that. I mean, that was just, they were trying to figure out a way to save his life so that he wouldn't be executed. And that was a way to garner sympathy. I mean, there's a lot of things that come into play that, sometimes aren't true because there's a reason why it's being done and said that way, like a lot of why the government has covered up so much of things that have nothing to do with the assassination.
By the way, and a complete footnote on Ruby, in 1963, 64, when the Warren Commission, the FBI is doing its work, there had been some speculation, some feeling among the agents covering the case that Ruby might have been gay. He was living with George Senator, a man, but that was never broached in the Warren Commission or anything else. It wasn't an issue, and it would have been considered far off the field at the time to even delve into. But Jack Ruby was an unusual, hot-headed, hot-tempered guy who had run-ins with the law, liked to keep a pistol on him, thought he was a tougher guy than he was in many ways. But you talk about somebody who had a hair trigger and impetuous, that opportunity presents itself that day when he walks down that garage entrance into the building where Oswald's about to be transferred, and these two moments of history strike each other within 48 hours of each other.
So, as we said, we have a U.S. presidential election coming up in a few days, and Donald Trump said there are more documents set for release in case he gets elected. So, what areas do you believe they may clarify? Is there any specific piece of information that you guys hope will be clarified by these documents?
There's nothing that is out there that will shed light on November 22nd, 1963. There is definitely information that would shed light on the history of the time period. So the Assassination Records Review Board, which both of us dealt with, I helped steer them quite a bit. I helped draft the definition of assassination record. I wrote a law review article before the board was constituted with a colleague of mine, of which they used that to help sketch out their rules and policies and procedures. And I met with them many times and gave them further guidance. And there was a very, very broad definition of what constitutes an assassination record. anything touching Cuba at that time, anything touching the Soviet Union at that time, anything that the Warren Commission had looked at, that the Pike Committee in the 70s had looked at, that the Church Committee in the 70s had looked at, that the House Select Committee in the 70s had looked at. No matter how far afield they were, if they touched upon it, that would be enveloped within the definition of assassination record. Most of the records that are still withheld are either they were tax records that the IRS has specific laws about. They were deeds of gift that they weren't government records of which the deeds of gift control, and they'd have to break through it, or there are other laws about it. I mean, the notion that there could be something that would reveal the assassination conspiracy. I mean, let's side with the conspiracists for a second. I'm sorry, do you really think someone wouldn't have destroyed those records decades ago? I mean, give me a break. And I'll let Gerald talk about his best friend, Roger Stone, who is a key advisor to President Trump back the first administration and even now, who has written a conspiracy book about the president, JFK conspiracy, and was all about releasing the records. And yet still President Trump didn't release the records. So do I think he's going to release anything more? No, that was a nice little campaign stump. Whoever whispers in President Trump's ear the second before he speaks, that's what he talks about.
So I agree with Mark that there's people will be disappointed when the last files are released, but both of us have had a steady position for years and years and years on this, and that is release the files.
Absolutely.
The idea that these files there are any files at all still being held back, and Mark's right. The tax records of Lee Harvey Oswald are still sealed in full. The tax records of Jack Ruby are still sealed in full. The notes taken by William Manchester of his interview with Jackie Kennedy for his book Death of a President are sealed in deference to the Kennedy family. Let's get some of this material that can be released out there. And one of the things that your listeners, Leonardo, may not be aware of is the Congress passed a law in 1992 to open up all the remaining sealed JFK files that they could find, these JFK records, as Mark was talking about, in response to this Oliver Stone film. They said, okay, Stone's created all this controversy, so let's get the records out. And if they are not released, they have to be released the final date, 25 years from the date we passed this. And the only person who will be able to extend the period for keeping them secret will be whoever is president of the United States at that time. They have no idea in 2017 who will be president. Well, guess what? It was Donald Trump. When that was happening, I'll show you how wrong I could be. I thought Trump would free all the files because he did have some of his advisors saying it's a conspiracy, and Trump often talked about the deep state, talked about it. So you'd think he's going to say, I'm not going to listen to any argument from the CIA or the bureaucrats about why these files should still be held. And he twice had opportunities to release them and didn't. When Biden came in, a president who really remembered the assassination and had a sense of history, I thought he would be the president to do it. So we've had two presidents now fail to do it. When Trump says, I'm going to do it this time, I always want to ask him, well, what about last time we had the opportunity? So, we will see them all one day, but I don't have high hopes for it changing the view of the case.
Yeah. And some other people don't realize, they think the Kennedy assassination was 61 years ago. Oh my God, that's such a long time. Although 25 years ago felt like a long time, and all of a sudden, boom, right? That's just flown by. But if you think about the Russian, the Soviet, and Cuban embassies in Mexico City, we, the United States, had assets, human assets in those embassies. That's one reason why we knew some of the stuff that was going on with Oswald. We also had photographic surveillance of the embassy, but we had listening devices also of the embassies, which we've never heard because the CIA says they destroyed them, which, we'll see. I mean, I'm sure they're gone now, but there's something else that was going on there. But we understand why, and this is part of where I'm getting at. 61 years ago, Oswald was 24, like Gerald said. So he was born in 1939. He would be 85 years old now. I know a lot of 85-year-olds. My dad's 87 years old. So some of the people working in the Cuban and the Soviet embassies who probably were providing information to the US government and maybe other governments, maybe the German government, maybe the Italian government. They're still alive. And they're maybe in Cuba or in Russia now. So there is still a real live danger. Now, that's probably a small amount of documents, but there is still a live danger to some human assets. There's also some danger from a sources and methods. This is the stuff I do when I represent CIA people, where there are some technologies, there are some devices that we used back then that we still either use today in some form or we gathered evidence or information that we can't, it would be a concern to reveal the Oswald part of it because it could show something else. And I mentioned before we started, so I can say it now. Gerald's talking about, you know, who knew who would be president in 2017. Well, the JFK Act was signed into law by George Bush in 1992, but then Bill Clinton came into office in 1993. It's Bill Clinton who appointed the five-member review board. And Bill Clinton, who had was awe-inspired by JFK. He met JFK when he was like, what, 14, 15 years old, something like that. There's a famous photo of Bill Clinton shaking JFK's hands somewhere. Uh, we always were told that the two things Bill Clinton wanted to know when he became the president of the United States, the most powerful person perhaps in the world, was, are there really UFOs? And who killed JFK? And you know what? We still don't have an answer or any different answer to those questions, notwithstanding that Bill Clinton was in the White House. So all these people, and you could talk, if you talk to the few surviving Warren Commission lawyers in particular, who, again, as I mentioned, were young, just starting in their careers, they will 201 tell you the biggest thing I would have ever done in my life was if I could have proved a conspiracy. Oh my God, that would have made my career. Of course, I was trying to prove a conspiracy. I just couldn't find the evidence.
Mark, what do you think when I went off and did a book for Random House to look into the Kennedy assassination? If I came back with a credible piece of evidence that convinced you, and at that time, the news anchors in America, which was Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, and the New York Times, that there was an absolute conspiracy in the assassination of the president in 1993, I would have been Woodward and Bernstein rolled up into one. It's a much bigger story to come back with as an investigative writer and say, by the way, I've got the proof of the conspiracy, than to come back and say, by the way, I think Oswald did it. The Warren Commission made some mistakes, but here's what's new. So they don't, I think people don't understand how, if there was a conspiracy, you'd want to find that, because that's the story that is really the much bigger tale. That's not for lack of looking for it, it's for lack of the evidence supporting it.
That works for me as well. I would be the richest YouTuber in the world if I could prove that it was a conspiracy behind this murder case. But of course, there's none. Unfortunately, or maybe of course, there's none. And the same applies to many other conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, where's the, well, there's a lot of money in obviously showing that there was no conspiracy theory because Gerald did very well with his book, as he should
Although I'll
have.
tell you, but literally, when you say that, it's interesting. So yes, Case Closed was a New York Times bestseller, but sells a fraction of what books like Best Evidence sold, which is a book that said they stole the coffin and did surgery on JFK's body to make it look like he was shot from behind. Probably a fraction of what Crossfire, which is a kitchen sink book about conspiracy theories, sold. And I think that a book
And
that
what
sold
was used as the base used by Oliver Stone that he
known as that. That's right. And I think
he
a million,
optioned it.
I mean, and a million copies, I think, have been sold in paperback and everything else of Rush to Judgment. Mark Lane's sort of defense for Oswald. So, you know, in terms of, if you're looking to pay your mortgage, concluding that Oswald did it alone may carry you for a year or so, but it's not going to pay off your mortgage.
And also keep in mind that books by conspiracy theorists are bought also by those who don't believe them. For instance, I have tons of conspiracy books about 9/11, JFK, Robert Kennedy, and so on. because if you want to study the case and debunk them, you have to know your enemy. So
Mhm.
I
I
have bunch of
literally I
them.
bought three JFK conspiracy books at a antique store yesterday that they're both modern and written in the last 20 years. I will never read them at all. I bought them just to have in my collection because I have hundreds and hundreds of assassination books.
Or maybe you want to read them to know what they say so that you can oppose them.
If I need to, I always look, this is a very DC thing to do. You look in the index first just to see if you're mentioned in it, and then you look at the rest of it, what's in the table of contents.
Well, guys, many thanks again for your time. I think that anybody who has been watching this video now has a clearer picture of what happened, and I hope we maybe have helped somebody change their minds if they believed at the beginning of this video that there was a conspiracy behind the murder of JFK. There was none. It was done by Lee Harvey Oswald, and he did it alone.
Hey, and if someone who's watching has conclusive evidence that it was a conspiracy, I'll represent you and Gerald will write about it.
That's absolutely true. And I do think that, Mark and Leonardo, even if somebody finishing this podcast isn't convinced as Oswald alone, what Mark and I suggest is you should put Oswald alone on your table of possibilities. So a lot of people think it's only a conspiracy, but Oswald alone is as strong. We think it's the accurate historical truth, but you have to consider it. And that means for people at least to study it. Many don't do it.
Absolutely. Thank you again, guys, for
Thank you.
having you join me today. Thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all in my next episode. Bye bye.